The smoky cantina on Station Nexus 9 buzzed with the usual crowd of mercenaries, traders, and off-duty soldiers from a dozen different species. The air recyclers struggled against the thick haze of exotic stimulants and the acrid smell of burned fuel that clung to everyone who worked the outer rim trade routes. Commander Vex Taylor limped through the entrance, her heavy boots clanking against the metal deck plating. Conversations died as heads turned. Even in this rough crowd, the legendary Hegemony Fleet Commander commanded respect. Her Catonis carapace bore the scars of countless battles, each mark telling a story of survival against impossible odds. Where her left arm should have been, a crude mechanical prosthetic whirred softly with each movement. "Commander on deck," someone whispered, but Vex Taylor waved dismissively with her good arm. "Save it for the parade ground," she growled, settling into her usual corner booth. The worn plasteel creaked under her weight. "Tonight I'm just another broken veteran drinking away bad memories." The younger hegemony officers gathered around her table like moths to a flame. Lieutenant Krexanala, barely out of the academy with her pristine uniform and eager eyes. Sergeant Zokthal, a demolitions expert who still believed in clean victories. Captain Mordain, who thought superior firepower solved everything. "Tell us about the Terran campaigns, Commander," Lieutenant Krexanala pleaded. "The instructors at the academy never give us the real details." Vex Taylor signaled the bartender, a hulking Braxian whose forearms could mix 6 drinks simultaneously. "Plasma wine, the strong stuff." She turned back to the expectant faces. "You want war stories? You think battle is glorious?" The young officers nodded eagerly. "You want to know about humans?" Vex Taylor's voice carried the weight of bitter experience, each word carefully measured. "Let me tell you about Research Station Eco 7. First lesson about fighting Terrans. Nothing is ever what it seems." Yeah. She took a long drink from the glowing blue liquid that arrived. The plasma wine burned down her throat, but it helped numb the phantom pain from her missing arm. "Intelligence briefing was simple," she continued. "Remote research facility orbiting the gas giant, Kepler 438b. 30 human scientists studying atmospheric formations and mineral extraction possibilities. No military installations, no weapon platforms, no defense grid. Standard civilian operation." Lieutenant Krexanala leaned forward. "Sounds like easy salvage." That's what Command thought. Vex Taylor's mandibles clicked in what passed for bitter laughter among her species. Standard resource extraction protocol. Jump in with overwhelming force, demand surrender, process the facility for useful technology and materials. Clean, efficient, profitable. The cantina around them continued its usual chaos. A group of Zenthran smugglers argued loudly over a card game while a lonely Altarian pilot nursed his drink and stared at holographic messages from home. The familiar sounds of interstellar lowlife provided backdrop to Vex Taylor's tale, I commanded. The task force personally, 3 hegemony destroyers against 1 civilian research station, Darkstar Ascendant, Shadow of Victory, and my flagship Eternal Dominion. Over 2,000 crew members, enough firepower to crack a small moon. She paused, watching the plasma wine swirl in her glass. "When we dropped out of hyperspace, humans immediately broadcast on all frequencies. Dr. Kim Taeho, their lead scientist, requested a 24-hour delay to evacuate non-essential personnel. Standard delaying tactic. I gave them 1 hour, Captain." Mordain nodded approvingly. "Proper protocol." The hour passed. No evacuation shuttles launched. No surrender beacon activated. Instead, those helpless researchers had spent 60 minutes turning their facility into something I'd never seen before. Vex Taylor's good hand clenched around her glass. Dr. Kim had somehow jury-rigged their stellar cartography array into a focused plasma beam system, instead of mapping star formations. Those sensors were now targeting our ships with deadly accuracy. Park Soman, their atmospheric specialist, had converted the chemical processors into aerosol weapon dispensers that could eat through hull plating. The young officers exchanged glances. This wasn't matching their textbook scenarios. But that was just the beginning, Vex Taylor continued. Engineer Li Dongwu had turned their mining drones into kamikaze fighters. Dozens of them, swarming. Around our destroyers like angry insects, each one packed with enough explosives to punch holes in our armor. She took another drink, her cybernetic eye glowing as old battlefield recordings played across her memory. The station's coffee maker, their actual breakfast preparation unit, had been modified into some kind of projectile launcher firing superheated metal slugs. Their waste recycling system became a chemical warfare factory. Even their communication array was broadcasting jamming signals that scrambled our targeting computers. Lieutenant Krexanala's eyes were wide. But surely 3 destroyers could handle one modified research station? You'd think so. Slaflock held no humor. We pounded that station for 72 hours straight. A continuous bombardment. Our gunners were exhausted from firing. Our energy reserves were running low, and still those humans kept fighting back. The cantina seemed quieter now, other patrons unconsciously leaning closer to catch the commander's words. Every time we knocked out one of their jury-rigged weapons, they'd have another one online within hours. They were literally rebuilding their defenses faster than we could destroy them. Dr. Kim's voice kept coming over the comm channels. Calm as if he was discussing the weather, coordinating their resistance. Vextelair's mechanical prosthetic word. As she gestured, when we finally breached their outer hull and prepared to board, we discovered they'd rigged the entire station to explode. Not just the power core, everything. Every room, every corridor, every piece of equipment wired with improvised explosives. The silence around the table was complete now. That Dr. Kim looked me in the eye through the viewport as my boarding. Teams prepared to breach. He activated the station's final transmission. No fear, no pleading, no attempt to negotiate. Just those words that still wake me up at night. She drained her glass and set it down with a sharp clink. You can have our research when you pry it from our cold, dead hands. The cantina remained deadly quiet, even the background noise seeming muted. They weren't soldiers. They hadn't trained for combat, hadn't studied military tactics, hadn't been conditioned for warfare. They were just scientists who decided that some things were worth more than their lives. Staller stood slowly, her prosthetic arms sparking slightly. They were just ... humans. The plasma wine had loosened Vextaller's tongue, and the haunted look in her cybernetic eye grew more intense. She stared past the gathered officers, seeing ghosts that only she could perceive. The battle of Kepler 4-4 to be still gives me nightmares. She continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The cantina's background noise seemed to fade as other patrons unconsciously leaned closer. Picture this, a barren moon, nothing but gray dust and ancient mining scars. No atmosphere worth breathing, no water, no vegetation, just rock and regret. She traced patterns on the table with her finger, drawing invisible battle lines. 50,000 human troops had been cut off during our initial push into the Kepler system, stranded on that worthless moon with limited supplies and no hope of reinforcement. Our intelligence counted them, cataloged their equipment, calculated their remaining resources down to the last meal ration. Lieutenant Krexanala shifted in her seat. Standard encirclement protocol. Better than standard. Vextaler's mandibles clicked with what might have been pride or regret. 200,000 hegemony forces in a perfect orbital blockade. Every approach vector covered, every possible escape route sealed. The humans were trapped like insects. In a jar, she gestured with her remaining arm, her prosthetics sparking as neural impulses misfired. Any rational species calculates odds. Mathematics doesn't lie. 4-1 numerical superiority, complete orbital control, unlimited supplies, versus their dwindling resources. Any sane military commander looks at those numbers and makes the logical choice. The young officers nodded. Basic military doctrine. Our psychological warfare division had run the projections. Human morale would collapse within 72 hours. Once they realized their situation, mass surrender was inevitable. We prepared processing facilities for 50,000 prisoners. A young hegemony officer leaned forward. They didn't surrender. Vextalar's laugh was harsh, like grinding metal. Colonel Lee Duhayan received our formal surrender demand at 0800 Standard Galactic Time. Full honors. It's guaranteed treatment according to Galactic War conventions. Immediate medical care for wounded personnel. She paused, taking another drink. His response came back exactly 6 minutes later. Not a lengthy military communique, not a negotiation attempt, not even a request for better terms. It's just a single word transmitted on all frequencies. The cantina held its breath. No, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. That's when. I knew we weren't fighting a normal enemy, Vextalor continued. Normal enemies weigh costs against benefits. Normal enemies preserve their forces for future battles. Normal enemies understand when they're beaten. Her cybernetic eye flickered. As combat recordings played across her memory banks, the humans had been studying that moon for months during their occupation. Every geological survey, every mining report, every seismic reading. While we saw a barren wasteland, they saw opportunity. Captain Mordain leaned forward. What kind of opportunity? Captain Choi Min Seo's engineering corps had mapped every abandoned mining tunnel, every unstable rock formation, every geological weak point. The first day of the siege, they collapsed 3 major tunnel systems simultaneously. Vex Taylor's voice took on the clinical tone of an after-action report, but her hands trembled slightly. Our advance columns were moving through the valleys when the ground simply disappeared beneath them. Avalanches of rock and debris buried entire battalions. 2,000 hegemony troops eliminated in coordinated geological warfare. She stood and began pacing, her mechanical leg leaving small scratches in the deck plating. But that was just the opening move. Lieutenant Yoon Hena had been a geothermal engineer before the war. She knew exactly how to redirect underground heat sources. Our troops would be advancing across what looked like solid ground. Then suddenly the earth would erupt in superheated steam. The alien soldiers shifted uncomfortably, imagining soldiers being cooked alive in their own armor. The moon's surface became a maze of death traps. Every step could trigger a landslide. Every position could become a scalding grave. We couldn't advance without losing hundreds of troops to the terrain itself. Vextala returned to her seat, her prosthetic arm. Worry as she reached for her glass. When our orbital bombardment cut their supply lines, they adapted. Sergeant Park Jin-ho's demolitions team started making explosives from their own rations. The same food keeping them alive became weapons against us. They learned to mix meal supplements with cleaning supplies to create compounds that could blow holes in our armored vehicles. Lieutenant Krexanala's eyes were wide. They were eating their own ammunition. Worse, they were turning everything into ammunition. When their vehicles broke down, they continued fighting on foot. We jammed their communications they developed. Systems using polished metal and reflected sunlight, smoke signals during the day, mirror flashes during the night. The commander's voice grew distant, lost in painful memories. I watched from orbit as they turned that dead moon into something alive and hostile. They dug tunnels connecting their positions, created hidden supply caches, established underground command centers. The entire moon became their fortress. Took a shaky drink. 8 months, she whispered. The siege lasted 8 months. By every tactical manual ever written, we should have crushed them in 8 hours. Instead, they started launching counterattacks using the moon's low gravity, like some kind of 3-dimensional battlefield. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the bartender had stopped mixing drinks. It turned physics itself into a weapon. Corporal Kim Sora could leap 30 meters in the low gravity, landing behind our lines with explosive charges. Lieutenant Lee Min-jun led squads that moved like they were flying, attacking from angles we never expected. Vextalara's good hand clenched into a fist. Our heavy armor was useless in low gravity. Our infantry could literally jump over our tanks. Our standard defensive positions meant nothing when enemies could attack from above, below, and directions. That didn't exist on normal worlds. She looked around the table at the stunned faces. Did you finally defeat them? Someone asked quietly. Defeat them? Vextalar's laugh was bitter, hollow, the sound of someone whose world had been shattered. After 8 months of continuous siege, after losing 60,000 troops to 50,000 humans, after watching them turn an empty moon into the most deadly battlefield in the galaxy, ... she drained her glass and set it down with finality. Broke our siege. 50,000 humans broke a siege by 200,000 hegemony forces. Colonel Lee Duhaen led a final assault that shattered our orbital positions and opened an escape corridor for his entire force. The mechanical prosthetic sparked again as her neural implants overloaded with traumatic memories. We retreated. The mighty hegemony fleet, with overwhelming numerical superiority and unlimited resources, retreated from 50,000 humans who refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. Vextaler stood again, her artificial legs struggling to support her weight. That's when I learned the most important lesson about fighting humans. They don't just fight with weapons or tactics or strategy. They fight with something we don't understand and can't replicate. She limped toward the bar, leaving the young officers sitting in stunned silence. They fight with the absolute refusal to believe they can lose. The cantina had grown completely silent now, save for the gentle hum of life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's massive engines. Even the card players had abandoned their games, drinks forgotten as they strained to hear every word. Vextalar's next words seemed to come from a place of deep trauma, each syllable carefully extracted like shrapnel from an old wound. The destroyer. Indomitable, she began, her cybernetic eye dimming as if the memories were too painful to process. Human vessel, Sol-class configuration, sleek design, built for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy combat. Standard crew complement of 230 souls. She paused, staring into her drink as if the swirling plasma wine held answers to questions she'd never asked. We caught them in the Vega system during a routine patrol sweep. Perfect. Ambush conditions. Asteroid field providing cover, no nearby reinforcements, complete surprise. 5 hegemony heavy cruisers materializing from hyperspace in coordinated attack formation. The officers around the table could picture the scene. Overwhelming firepower against a single enemy vessel. The Indomitable was running silent, probably. Conducting long-range reconnaissance, Captain Kong Woo-jin had maybe 30 seconds between our arrival and weapons lock. Any reasonable commander would have immediately activated emergency beacons and prepared for surrender. Vextalar's prosthetic arm twitched, servo motors whining softly. Instead, Captain Kong opened a channel to my flagship. No panic in his voice, no desperate pleading, just calm professionalism. He said, "Hegemony vessels, this is Captain Kang. Woo-jin of the Terran destroyer Indomitable. We do not acknowledge your authority in this system. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." A nervous laugh escaped from one of the younger officers. 1 ship against 5 cruisers? That's exactly what I thought. Vextalar continued. I gave the standard surrender demand, 60 seconds. To power down weapons and prepare for boarding? Captain Kong's response was to charge his main guns and lock targeting systems on my flagship. She stood and began pacing again, her mechanical leg leaving small scratches in the deck plating with each step. Standard engagement protocols followed. We opened fire with coordinated volleys designed to disable rather than destroy. We wanted their ship intact for intelligence gathering. Clean, efficient, by-the-book space combat. The commander's voice took on the mechanical tone of someone reciting technical specifications, but her hands trembled with suppressed emotion.
Ow.
First salvo crippled their main engines. Plasma conduits severed, thrust vectoring completely offline. The Indomitable went into an uncontrolled spin, venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. She paused at the bar, ordering another plasma wine with a gesture. Second salvo targeted their weapon systems. Direct hits on the main gun turrets, missile launch bays reduced to twisted metal. Their defensive grid collapsed completely. Third salvo took out their main reactor. The bartender slid the glowing drink across the bar, his 4 arms moving with practiced efficiency. 17 hull breaches. Life support failure across 6 decks. Main power offline, backup systems failing. Half the crew killed in the opening exchange. By every tactical assessment, the Indomitable was dead in space. Vextalar returned to the table, her cybernetic eye flickering as it processed traumatic data files. "So they surrendered?" asked a junior officer. Hopefully, the commander's laugh was hollow, like wind through a graveyard. They kept fighting. The words hung in the recycled air, like an accusation. For 6 hours, that dead ship kept firing. Not with main guns, those were scrap metal. Not with missiles, the launch systems were destroyed. They were using point defense lasers, maintenance tools, anything that could hurt us. She took a long drink, the plasma wine glowing briefly in her throat. Engineer Kim So-hee had sealed herself in the engine room when the reactor breach began. Instead of evacuating, she started emergency repairs using uniform fabric as pressure seals, her own toolkit as replacement parts. Power distribution for 6 hours, routing emergency power to weapon systems that shouldn't have been able to function. The alien officers exchanged glances. This was beyond their understanding of normal combat behavior. Gunner Park Ji-woo lost both his targeting computers in the first exchange. The automated systems were fried, the backup controls destroyed, so he started operating the remaining point defense cannons by hand. Using manual calculations and pure instinct to track our movements, Vexteller's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme stress in her species. Communications specialist Lee Jun-ho had his entire console exploded by shrapnel. But he kept coordinating their defense, using handheld devices and jury-rigged transmitters. When those failed, he started using emergency lights to send coded signals between different sections of the ship. The cantina's atmosphere felt thick with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. We boarded after 4 hours of this insanity. My assault teams expected to find corpses and surrender flags. Instead, they found humans barricaded in every corridor, fighting room by room with improvised weapons and desperate courage. Prosthetic arms sparked again, neural interfaces overloading with combat data. Commander Lee Yoo-jin was on the bridge, still issuing tactical orders while bleeding out from shrapnel wounds across her chest and arms. She'd been coordinating ship-wide defense using hand signals because their internal communications were completely destroyed. Blood pooling on the deck plates, but her voice never wavered. The young officers sat transfixed, unable to comprehend such dedication. The medical officer, Dr. Han Minji, had converted the ship's gymnasium into an emergency surgery center. She was performing operations in zero gravity while the ship was still under fire. Using improvised tools and whatever supplies she could scavenge from destroyed medical bays, Vexteller's voice cracked slightly. When my boarding teams reached the engineering section, they found Ensign Choi Dae-yoon welding damaged hull plates from the inside while exposed to hard vacuum. She'd jury-rigged a makeshift pressure suit for maintenance gear and was literally holding the ship together with her bare hands. She drained her glass and set it down with a sharp crack. 6 hours. He fought a 6-hour running battle in a ship that should have been a tomb after the first exchange. Every system destroyed, every advantage lost, half their crew dead or dying, and they never stopped fighting back. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. When we finally reached the bridge, Captain Kang was slumped in his command chair, kept conscious only by emergency medical injectors. His left arm was gone, his uniform soaked with blood, but his eyes were still sharp with defiance. Vextaylor looked around the table at the stunned faces. He looked directly at me through his cracked helmet visor and said, "I'll have to kill every last one of us." Then, with his dying breath, he tried to activate the ship's self-destruct sequence using his remaining hand. Her mechanical prosthetic clenched into a fist. Stopped him, barely. But in that moment, I realized we weren't fighting soldiers or warriors or even fanatics. We were fighting something far more dangerous. She stood slowly, age and injury making every movement painful. We were fighting humans who had decided that some things mattered more than their own survival. The cantina remained frozen in absolute silence as Vexteller limped toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of alien officers who suddenly understood why the war against humanity had been so costly. They had learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest guns, but the one who refuses to die quietly. Vextaylor had returned to her seat, but something had changed in her demeanor. The hard edge of a veteran warrior seemed to crack, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. Her cybernetic eye dimmed to barely a flicker, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made the entire cantina lean forward. "But the most terrifying thing about humans," she continued, her voice now barely audible above the station's humming systems, "wasn't their refusal to die. It was what happened after the Battle of Tau Ceti." She seemed to age visibly as she spoke, as if the memories were physically draining her life force. 3 days of continuous fleet engagement in the Tau Ceti system. The most brutal space battle I'd ever witnessed. It's no fancy maneuvers, no clever tactics, just raw firepower and the will to use it. Both sides committed everything, every ship, every weapon, every life. Her prosthetic arm twitched as neural pathways misfired, processing trauma that even advanced hegemony medical technology couldn't fully repair. My flagship, the Sovereign's Wrath, is the pride of the hegemony fleet. Massive dreadnought-class vessel, crew of 4,000, enough firepower to glass a planet. We'd never lost a major engagement. She paused, staring at her reflection. In the polished table surface, Admiral Park Tae-woo's task force had been hunting us for weeks. 12 human vessels against our battle group of 8 ships. The humans were outgunned, outmanned, but they'd chosen their battlefield perfectly. The alien soldiers leaned closer, sensing this story would be different from the others. Tau Ceti had an unstable solar corona, electromagnetic storms that played havoc with targeting systems. Both fleets were essentially fighting blind, relying on close-range sensors and instinct. Perfect conditions for human unpredictability. Vex Taylor's good hand traced battle formations on the table's surface. Day 1 was standard fleet engagement. Long-range bombardment, probing attacks, testing each other's defenses. We thought we had the advantage with our heavier armor and more powerful weapons. Her voice took on the clinical tone of an after-action report, but underneath was something raw and painful. Day 2. The humans started using the electromagnetic storms as cover. Admiral Park's destroyers would vanish in 2. The solar interference then emerge at point-blank range for devastating hit-and-run attacks. We lost 2 cruisers to tactics we'd never encountered. She stood and walked to the cantina's small viewport, staring out at the stars. Day 3 was pure chaos. Both fleets locked in close combat, ships passing within kilometers of each other, firing everything they had. The Sovereign's Wrath took direct hits from 3 human heavy cruisers simultaneously. Her reflection in the transparasteel looked haggard, broken. Reactor containment failed. Not a complete breach, but radiation. Flooding through 6 decks. Life support systems overloaded, trying to scrub the contamination. Emergency bulkheads sealed automatically, trapping my crew in irradiated sections. The officers around the table could imagine the horror. Radiation poisoning was one of the most feared ways to die in space. 23 of my officers were caught. In the worst contaminated areas, my chief engineer, 2 navigation specialists, the entire torpedo room crew. They had maybe hours before the radiation killed them. Our medical bay was destroyed in the same attack that breached the reactor. Vex Taylor returned to her seat, her mechanical leg dragging slightly. Standard hegemony protocol is simple in such situations. Die with honor. Let your enemies die with honor. Clean. Efficient. No unnecessary suffering. We don't torture prisoners, and we don't expect mercy from defeated foes. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, but these humans, they'd spent 3 days trying to kill us. Brutal, vicious fighting. No. Quarter asked or given. I'd watched them ram damaged ships into our formations rather than retreat. They'd shown no mercy to our wounded, no hesitation in targeting life support systems. A young ensign whispered, "What happened?" Vex Taylor's cybernetic eye flickered back to life, displaying data that only she could see. The moment our ship went dead in space, drifting powerless with radiation alarms screaming on every frequency, Admiral Park's flagship changed course. Not to finish us off, not to demand surrender. She took a shaky breath. He ordered immediate rescue operations, not capture rescue. While the battle was still raging around us, while his other ships were engaged with the remainder of our fleet, he diverted resources to save enemy crew members who were dying of radiation poisoning. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background conversations had stopped. Commander Ojine's medical team boarded our ship through hull breaches that were still venting atmosphere. No security escort, no weapons drawn. Just medical. Personnel with emergency radiation treatment equipment. Her good hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white with tension. Dr. Lim Hai-young worked for 18 straight hours treating our wounded, using their own limited medical supplies. She could have been treating her own people, but instead, she was saving the lives of enemies who had been trying to kill her, just hours earlier. Vextaler's voice became thick with emotion she struggled to suppress. Lieutenant Colonel Seo Minho personally carried 3 of my dying officers to their medical bay. These same humans who had been trying to vaporize us with concentrated plasma fire were now sharing their food, their medicine, their own blood for emergency transfusions. She stood again, pacing restlessly. I watched through security feeds as human medics worked alongside our own medical staff. No supervision, no guards, complete trust. Dr. Lim even showed our doctors new radiation treatment techniques, sharing medical knowledge in the middle of a war zone. The mechanical prosthetic sparked as her neural implants struggled to process conflicting data. When the immediate crisis passed, when our crew was stable and the radiation contained, I confronted Admiral Park. I had to understand what I'd witnessed. Vextalor stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled officers. I asked him why. Why save enemies who would have let his people die? Why show mercy to a species that had never shown mercy to humans? Why risk his own medical resources and personnel for creatures who had spent 3 days trying to kill him? The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Admiral Park looked at me with those strange human eyes, not the cold calculation I expected from a military commander, but something warm and infinitely sad. He said, "Because that's what separates us from monsters." Vextaler took a shaky drink, her hand trembling slightly. I pressed him further, pointed out that we were enemies, that my crew would return to fight against humanity again if they survived, that mercy in war was weakness, compassion was tactical error. Her cybernetic eye dimmed again. She just nodded and said, "Maybe. But if saving lives makes us weak, then I choose weakness. If showing mercy makes us tactical failures, then we'll fail with honor. Because the moment we stop seeing enemies as living beings worthy of compassion, we become the very monsters we're fighting against." The commander returned to her seat, looking older and more fragile than when the evening began. I understood their weapons, brutal but effective. I understood their tactics, unpredictable but logical. I even understood their refusal to surrender, stubborn but admirable. She finished her drink and set the empty glass down with finality. But this mercy after such hatred, this compassion after such violence, its ability to see enemies as people worth saving, even in the middle of combat. Vextalar looked around the table at faces that reflected her own confusion and fear. That broke something in my mind that has never healed. Because I realized that humans don't just fight differently than us. They think differently, feel differently, exist on a moral level that we can't comprehend. She stood slowly, preparing to leave. We can match their technology, counter their tactics, even survive their refusal to quit. But how do you fight an enemy whose greatest strength is their refusal? To become monsters, even when being a monster would be easier? The cantina remained frozen and contemplative. Silence, as the implications settled over the alien officers like a heavy shroud. They were beginning to understand that the war against humanity wasn't just a military conflict. It was a confrontation with a species that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of warfare itself. Vextaler set down her empty glass and looked around the table at the assembled alien officers. Young faces filled with the confidence of a superior military force, just as she had once been. Their pristine uniforms bore no scars, their eyes held no ghosts. Their certainty remained unbroken by the harsh reality of combat against an enemy. That defied all logic. "You're all wondering why I'm telling you these stories," she said, her cybernetic eyes scanning each face around the table. "Why an old veteran is filling your heads with tales of human stubbornness and impossible victories." "Lieutenant." Krexanala shifted uncomfortably. "Commander, surely the hegemony learned from these encounters. Our current battle doctrine must account for human tactics." Vextaler's laugh held no humor, only the bitter wisdom of hard-earned experience. The hegemony high command spent years analyzing human military doctrine after the ceasefire, she began, her voice taking on the formal tone of someone delivering classified intelligence. Teams of our best strategic minds, military analysts, xenobiologists, and tactical specialists studied every engagement, every tactic, every weapon system humans had deployed. She gestured to the cantina around them, filled with representatives. Of a dozen different species, they interviewed thousands of survivors like me, built detailed computer models of human behavior patterns, analyzed captured equipment, intercepted communications, battlefield recordings, the most comprehensive enemy study in hegemony history. The young officers leaned forward, eager for insights that might give them advantage in future conflicts. Expected to find some secret technology that made humans so effective? Advanced artificial intelligence, perhaps, or weapon systems we hadn't detected. Maybe sophisticated battle coordination networks, or new forms of tactical analysis. Leaned forward, her scarred face catching the dim cantina light. Shadows dancing across features that had seen too much combat. What they found was far more terrifying than any weapon. The young officers waited, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. Humans don't fight to win, Vex Taylor said slowly, each word carefully measured. They fight because surrender isn't in their genetic code. Not metaphorically, literally. Something in their evolutionary development removed the ability to simply give up when faced with overwhelming odds. Captain Mordain frowned. That's impossible. Every species has survival instincts that include strategic retreat and resource preservation. Every species except humans, Vex Taylor replied. Every single engagement we studied showed the same pattern. From Corporal Kim Jinzu, holding a trench alone against 50 attackers for 14 hours until reinforcements arrived.
Admiral.
Yun Sora ramming her damaged carrier directly into our dreadnought rather than allowing her crew to be captured. She stood slowly, her mechanical prosthetic whirring softly as servos adjusted to support her weight. The analysts found over 3,000 documented cases of individual humans fighting against impossible odds rather than surrendering. Not elite troops or specially trained commandos, ordinary soldiers, engineers, medical personnel, even civilian researchers. Her cybernetic eye flickered as it accessed memory files. Every battle was fought as if the survival of their entire species depended on that one moment. A single human defending a supply depot treated it like the most important military objective. In the galaxy, a medical team protecting wounded treated each patient like they were personally responsible for humanity's future. Vextalar began pacing again, her artificial leg leaving small scratches in the deck plating. We could match their technology. Our plasma rifles were just as effective as theirs. Our armor equally protective. We outnumbered them 3-1. Across every front, our ships were larger, our weapons more powerful, our logistics systems more efficient. The assembled officers nodded. Basic military mathematics suggested hegemony victory should have been inevitable. Our tactics were proven. Across a dozen successful campaigns against other species, we'd conquered the Altarian Federation, absorbed the Zenthran Alliance, eliminated the Crystalline Collective. Every enemy had eventually calculated the cost of continued resistance and negotiated surrender. Vex Taylor's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than her earlier shouts. But we could never match their refusal to accept defeat. Colonel Anji-hoon fought for 36 hours straight with 3 broken ribs and a shattered spine, directing artillery fire, while paralyzed from the waist down. Captain Lee So-jin continued issuing tactical orders after losing both arms to plasma burns. Using voice commands and eye movements, the cantina seemed to hold its breath, other patrons unconsciously drawn into the tale. Actor Park Min-woo performed battlefield surgery while under continuous artillery bombardment, saving lives while explosions shook the ground beneath his operating table. Sergeant Choi Hyun-woo held a communications post for 6 days without food or water, maintaining contact between separated units. Her mechanical prosthetic clenched into a fist. The war didn't end because we defeated humanity. Didn't end it because the Hegemony High Command realized something that still keeps me awake at night. Humans would literally fight till every last one of them was dead, rather than submit to conquest. She stopped pacing and faced the table directly. They weren't just willing to die for their freedom, they were eager to. Every analysis showed the same conclusion. Humans viewed death in battle as preferable to life under occupation, not as a noble sacrifice, but as the natural choice when, faced with subjugation, Lieutenant Krexanala's voice was barely audible. How is that possible? Their own history explains it, Vexnala replied. Thousands of years of warfare on their home planet, constant conflict that eliminated any genetic or cultural tendency toward easy surrender. Only the groups that refused to give up survived to pass on their genes and their values. She moved toward the cantina's viewport, staring out at the stars. Final analysis report was classified at the highest levels. The conclusion was simple. Humanity represents an evolutionary dead end that cannot be conquered through conventional means. They will fight until extinction rather than accept defeat. The young officers exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to crack. High Command made the logical decision. The cost of continuing the war against humans would eventually exceed the value of any territory or resources we might gain. We negotiated the ceasefire not from a position of weakness, but from mathematical necessity. She turned toward the exit, then paused. Sometimes the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy isn't what you can build or how many ships you can deploy. Sometimes it's simply who you are at your core. And humans, at their core, are the kind of species that looks at impossible odds and says, "Watch this." Vextalor limped toward the door, her artificial legs struggling with each step. You want to know why I'm telling you these stories? 'Cause someday one of you might face humans in combat. And when that day comes, you need to understand what you're really fighting. Her voice carried across the now silent cantina. You're not fighting soldiers or warriors or even fanatics. You're fighting a species that has forgotten how to quit. That treats surrender as a concept that simply doesn't apply to them, that views impossible odds as an interesting challenge rather than a reason to retreat. As Vextalar reached the door, her final words echoed through the silent cantina. The galaxy learned that day that there are fates worse than death, and one of them is fighting a species that has forgotten how to quit. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the young alien officers alone with their thoughts and their suddenly diminished confidence and hegemony superiority. They sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of everything they'd heard. Their textbook strategies seemed inadequate, their numerical advantages meaningless, their technological superiority irrelevant. Captain Mordain was the first to speak, his voice hollow. How do you fight an enemy like that? Lieutenant Krexanala stared at her untouched drink. Maybe, maybe you don't. The cantina slowly returned to its normal atmosphere, but the young officers remained at their table long into the stations. Night cycle. Wrestling with a terrible new understanding, they had just learned why the human sectors remained free, why the mighty hegemony fleet had negotiated peace with a numerically inferior enemy, and why experienced veterans like Vextaler spoke of humans with a mixture of respect and terror, in a galaxy where warfare was typically a matter of logistics and mathematics. Humanity represented something far more dangerous, a species for whom the concept of acceptable losses simply didn't exist. The lesson was clear. Even if its implications were terrifying, sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest fleet, but the one who refuses to acknowledge that defeat is even possible. The end.